Well, I'm excited to welcome everyone to our first Friday seminar here at CPC for the spring semester. And I'm Lisa Pierce. I'm in sociology and I direct the population science training program. I am even more excited to introduce our speaker today, who is Jessica Halliday Hardie. And Jessica was a Ph.D. student in sociology, a trainee, a pre-doc trainee here at CPC. And so it's fabulous having her back. I was fortunate to serve as her advisor and preceptor, and we continue to collaborate, and one of my favorite collaborators. So it's good to have her back with us. And the first time she's been back, when she finished. So we're talking about now everything that has changed. So Jess is a sociologist. She got her PhD in 2009 in social demography. She studies education, inequality, family health, transition to adulthood, and usually in very integrated ways. I'm going to see some of that come to life today. She has a very excellent publication record, publishing in places like Social Forces, Journal of Marriage and Family. And then she recently published this book, Best Laid Plans, Women Coming of Age in Uncertain Times. We're going to hear more about that today. And I skipped over the part I was going to say. Currently, she is at Hunter College and the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. In between, she did a postdoc at Penn State Population Research Institute and was assistant professor for 2 years at University of Missouri, Kansas City, and then ended up at her current professional home. Yeah, please join me in welcoming Jessica and welcoming her back. And I look forward to hearing all about it.
Thank you. Thank you for coming today. This book was a very long labor of love that I started when I was here as a graduate student. And as a warning, as I say before, demography audiences, this is a qualitative work. My argument for being a qualitative researcher and quantitative in demography is that demography is built on careful description, and that's what I aim for in my qualitative work as well. How do I describe the experiences of a group in a way that uncovers something about the social world? So this book explores a central puzzle about the role of aspirations and planning in young people's attainment. High aspirations and careful planning are thought to be key drivers in young people's attainment. And this is true in the scholarly literature as well as in media reports, the way things are portrayed writ large. Yet aspirations have grown markedly more ambitious over time, and still we see the replication of social class background, where high aspirations don't pay off for all young people. So I asked, what role do plans for the future play in the intergenerational transmission of inequality among young women? And in the sociological literature, a lot of this interest and aspiration started with the status attainment model. The idea behind this model is that parents' occupational and educational attainment is related to their children's attainment, and then much of this association is explained by social psychological factors, such as parents and teachers' encouragement to go to college, peers' college plans, and aspirations. But simply, this model suggests that young people who grow up in higher status families aspire towards higher status goals, and young people who grow up in lower status families aspire towards lower status goals. And these aspirations become plans, leading young people to disparate educational and subsequently occupational attainment. And this model suggests, therefore, that to lessen the degree of intergenerational inequality and the replication of social class over generations, we must encourage working class and poor young people to dream big, right? And that will solve their problems. And this, the status attainment model evolved around the same time of other work that look at aspirations. Willis's Learning to Labor looked at working class young men in England, and his lads rebelled against school and created a culture of opposition that created the conditions under which they eventually stayed in the working class. Similarly, McLeod's Hallway Hangers were white working class young men in the US who rejected schooling to their detriment. McLeod's work also looked at the brothers who were Black working class young men who did hold high aspirations, but still fell short of their goals. And both works showed how aspirations are structured by class background, and McLeod brings in the complexities of race as well. But both fell short when trying to explain the outcomes of young people who had higher aspirations but still fell short, And they also focus on young men to the exclusion of young women. And much of the status attainment literature does that as well. So beginning in the 1990s, things started to switch. And now there was concern over too much ambitiousness among young people. Aspirations were rising and attainment was not. So Ruth Seidel worried that women wanted the house on the hill through financial independence, but were not aware enough of the need for dual incomes and the constraints placed on them by gender. Mickelson observed that Black young people had higher aspirations than white young people, but these were abstract rather than concrete. And so while they believed in the power of education, they didn't see it working for those around them. And Schneider and Stevenson argued that young people were ambitious in their occupational plans, but didn't necessarily know how much education they needed for them. So some aspired to more education than they needed for the job they wanted to hold, and sometimes less. But either way, this unaligned aspirations were responsible for young people falling short. These arguments are similar to the social psychological theory of planful competence, which argues that if young people are planful, if they are realistic, think long-term, and plan carefully, they're more likely to be successful. So on the one hand, prior work suggests that young people are not ambitious enough, and that explains disparities in outcomes. Other evolving work argued that young people are too ambitious and therefore not realistic, and that explained why they were falling short. So either way, these perspectives argue that if young people have the right plans, then and work hard, they can achieve their goals. Whether young people succeed is unseen as a story about agency and structure, where structure is seen as a set of barriers that young people must navigate over the course of the transition to adulthood. Yet these perspectives imply that structure is static and unidimensional, and that agency is something individuals do to navigate structure. And I would argue that we can better understand the role of aspirations in planning and getting ahead if we return to Sewell's definition of structure as sets of resources and schemas that mutually imply and sustain each other. And agency is a capacity to enact one's will by creatively transposing schema. So a simple example, the reason I'm presenting here today like this is both because of the mental map I have of what a talk looks like, as well as the physical structure of this room, right? And so our ability to be agentic is constrained by both physical structures of our social world, as well as the mental maps we hold. We can move this over to the idea of aspirations. As Sewell put it, what kinds of desires people can have, what intentions they can form, and what sorts of creative transpositions they can carry out vary dramatically from one social world to another, depending on the nature of particular structures that inform these social worlds. Without a notion of heaven and hell, a person cannot strive for admission into paradise. Only in a modern capitalist economy can one attempt to make a killing on the futures market. And similarly, the structure of the higher education landscape, in particular, the complexity of the loan processes and rules and the internal tracks, and its connection to the labor force shape both young people's plans and how they achieve or do not achieve these plans. At the same time, young people possess resources, including information that allow them to navigate the educational landscape creatively or not. My argument here is that all young people are agentic in pursuit of their goals to some degree. They don't have agency or not, but it is the intersection of agency and structures that determine these disparate outcomes. Because of this, it's possible to make all the right moves and without the right resources and not get to where you want to with your goals. I also take into account life course perspective in this work, and particularly the emphasis on trajectories over time. So this is longitudinal work, but also thinking about what came before the times that I talked to these young women that I interviewed, the importance of linked lives and the role of social networks and social capital in informing trends, as well as a historical context. So these young women were graduating high school in the midst of the Great Recession, at a time we're still in at near universal aspirations for college and increasing student loan debt. There was, for decades, rise in precarious work and difficulty getting hours for those at the lower end of the labor market, which affect their transitions to adulthood as well, and then changing attitudes towards gender, family, and work. So I asked, what roles do plans for the future play in the intergenerational transmission of inequality among young women? And in this, how are plans formed in adolescence, and what do they include, and how does this differ by social class and race? And then also, how are plans pursued, amended, or discarded in the transition to adulthood? So I interviewed junior and senior high school girls at 2 high schools in the Midwest, recruited through school surveys. And I focused on young women who are interested in health, suggestion by Barbara back when I was a graduate student, because it allowed me to focus on a particular field and compare among different levels of aspiration within that field, as well as picking a field in which I could evaluate the sort of accuracy of their plan. Something like business or the arts, you can get at your aspirations in different ways. I tried to balance my sample as much as possible by race and social class as well, using various proxies for social class from the surveys that I had. And so ultimately, I interviewed 61 young women between the ages of 16 and 18 in 2008, and then followed up with 2/3 of them when they were in their early mid-20s. And the young women I interviewed were mixed by class and race. I initially categorized them as middle class, working class, or poor, but then combined working class and poor because they had fairly similar experiences. So 25 were middle class and 36 were working class or poor. And then there was a mix. Both high schools that I was working in were primarily white and Black, and so that's the majority of my sample. A few of the young women were Latina as well. And as you can see, I'll talk more about their aspirations, but basically the young people, regardless of class background, were had fairly high aspirations. They wanted to go to college. They wanted to generally hold professional careers. And due to the fact that I conducted this data over a long period of time and have only just now published this book, I reanalyzed the transcripts many times in Atlas TI and Deduce by hand, Word, and Excel. All of these ways are very helpful, using iterative coding processes where I code larger themes first and then analytic codes, and also going back through transcripts to search for disconfirming evidence. Two of the tools that helped the most towards the end, I had just Word document profiles of each young woman, summarizing major themes, important quotations, as well as analysis by myself and graduate students for analytic notes. As well as output tables in Excel, where I summarize key points and compare it across groups. So my key arguments in this book are first that the process of planning for the future is structured by resources such as information, lack of disruptions, and money that differ by social class and race, and is learned and reapplied over time, meaning that young people, especially advantaged young people, learn how to plan for the future through their experiences in high school and continue to apply that knowledge, creatively transposing schemas when they're in college. Second, that the educational landscape creates pitfalls for working class and poor young women that exploit their high aspirations. And these pitfalls exist because of loans, as well as college programs that don't pay off in the labor market. And finally, that the deregulation of the labor market affects young women through their own work and through their families' work. And this is particularly important for young women because when family members have to work long hours, they may be called upon to take care of younger siblings, the household, and things like that in ways that are gendered. The way the book is structured is in part one, I talk about the girls' plans when they were in high school, and in part two, I follow up with them in young adulthood. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the second part, so I'll go over some quick themes in the first part first. So overall, when I interviewed these girls, they had strikingly similar goals for their schoolwork and family lives. This meant, as I showed before, they were all generally fairly ambitious, but also they saw their lives in the future looking fairly similar. They wanted a middle-class lifestyle, steady income, having completed college, having a good career, being married, having children, and so on. And I will say in the book, I talk a little bit more about family goals, and I'm happy to talk about how they thought about work and family, but just can't get everything into this presentation. So I'll talk more about school and work for the most part. There were some differences in anticipated timing. So white working class and poor girls anticipated work, school, and moving in with their significant others to occur a little bit earlier, usually by about a year. And Black girls anticipated school, marriage, and home buying happening a little bit later within each social class. But generally, those were, again, like 6 months to a year difference at most. Middle-class young women anticipated packaged futures. And what I mean by this is when they looked at the future and that they talked about the aspirations they had, they wanted to replicate the lives that they already had. And so they knew what that was like. They already lived in middle-class households. They could envision it very clearly. And they had that sort of cohesive idea of what their futures might look like. Those in the working class and poor hoped for repackaged futures, meaning they didn't want the lives that they lived at the moment. They wanted certain things changed, but they had to pull together what that looked like from, their friends' families, if they had middle-class friends, or from television, from things that they rejected in their own home lives. So they talked a lot about, not wanting to scrape by, or not wanting to worry about bills, things like that, which were rejections of what they saw around them on a more daily basis. So in talking about their plans, I'm going to focus on social capital in particular. And for white middle-class young women, social capital played a large role in the production of their future plans. Certainly their parents helped them plan for the future, but in addition to this, they got help from their parents' friends, parents, relatives, professionals they met one young woman went with her father to a physical therapy appointment. She wanted to be a physical therapist. She started talking to them. They said, oh, you can come back, you can shadow, you can have opportunities here. Those kinds of things were readily available to them and informed their plans in a very detailed way. Black middle-class young women had smaller social networks, but also they weren't offered the same kind of support. They'd say, oh, I asked my doctor about what this would look like, and she told me some information, but that was it. Whereas other young women who are white were given many more resources. Doctors offered to write letters for them, things like that, if they had a close relationship. And so these differences meant that Black middle-class young women were very ready for college. Usually their parents did a lot of heavy lifting in that regard, but had less information about their occupational aspirations. Whereas white middle-class young women generally had more to rely on in that regard. So Jordan, for example, who is deciding between being a pharmacist and she was a Black middle-class young woman deciding between being a pharmacist or finance, had been able to shadow a pharmacy technician. And when I asked her what pharmacists do, she said they analyze scripts, and I don't know exactly what they do. I know more what technicians do because they count pills. Whereas Gail, who's a white middle-class young woman, told me all about how pharmacists could work in hospitals or drugstores or for insurance companies. She knew the sort of full scope of what that would look like. In the working class and poor, social capital also mattered, but the social capital was much more reciprocal, meaning that working class and poor young women both gave resources to adults around them and received them, and they were more often focused on the here and now. So Sandra, for example, whose mother was disabled and her family was poor, she completed her high school classes early each day. She didn't have the last couple of periods of the day, and she would go home and clean the house and then go to work. They also lived with her young cousins that they were helping take care of because of her aunt's medical problems, and they also helped take care of her brother's children. Her dad did home repairs for her aunt, and Sandra also related that her grandmother, who worked in a hospital, helped her understand difficult medical terminology when she had a health scare. Her grandmother also promised that she was going to help her plan for getting scholarships, but she said her grandmother was always working and they hadn't had time to talk about it. So again, these resources were available, but they were focused on the here and now and less about planning. And of course, often their social ties didn't know as much about college as well. So then my question when I went back to these young women is, how is this going to matter? Certainly I saw similar levels of aspirations, and I also saw aligned aspirations among almost all the young women. They knew how much education they needed for the jobs they wanted. That wasn't the difference in detail. But there were certainly differences in social capital and sort of in the process they went about planning. So in the second half of the book, I look at where they are, and I sort of categorize them in three general groups: on track, holding on, and navigating rough seas. And these are, they're young, so we don't know, what their class destination is entirely, but on track is generally on track to the middle class. Holding on is kind of still holding on to those aspirations, but really trying to pull things together. And navigating rough seas, young women were often in a lot of financial difficulty and sort of in and out of work and school. So as we can see, the largest story, so the darkest lines indicate the most common trajectories, and the most common trajectories, as we might expect in the US, is class replication, middle-class young women going on track and so forth. The next most common trajectory was downward mobility. So middle class going to holding on group, or working class going on to navigating rough seas. And the least common trajectory was either upward mobility by one or drastic downward mobility. Notably, there were no poor young women who ended up on track, but there were some middle class young women who ended up navigating rough seas. So the first group, being on track, refers to two qualities. First, that in young adulthood, these young women were moving steadily toward a career that would likely garner them at least middle-class status. And second, that they were guided and moved along by institutional structures or tracks that eased their way. Good planning in high school aided many of them in being on track, but so did economic stability, both in high school and now in college, and institutional and social ties. And many of these young women brought the lessons that they had learned in high school about planning into the college setting, were able to pull on social ties within those institutional tracks or institutions writ large around the college. Jordan, for example, who I mentioned before, had decided by the time she was in college that she wanted to go into a finance track. She was admitted to a small selective Catholic school fairly nearby her family and near her sister. And she excelled in college. She was in an honors program. She was in a number of student of color organizations, a Black Student Association, Accounting Association for Black Students, and so on, where she was often a leader in these organizations. She had two academic advisors, one in her honors program and one in her major, and a mentor through the mentoring program who is a Black woman working in business. And this mentor, she relayed, taught her to navigate the norms of the business world. For example, she said that her mentor said, like, you have to like different food. You have to know things like filet mignon is not undercooked hamburger, right? And even though these are kind of like little things, they help her navigate that world and learn the cultural capital of being in business. And she also was able to get internships through one of her organizations for 2 summers and was able to decide that she wanted to go into private accounting rather than public accounting based on her experiences in those internships. So in general, young women on track were often in these pre-professional or specialized programs within colleges or universities. 2 were also majoring in the practical arts, which were kind of more limited versions of that. And the remainder majored in the liberal arts, but forged productive ties with mentors. And so these kinds of things offer them personalized advising, information sharing, and contacts with professionals. It also helped them because many young women, when they first enter college, have experienced lowered grades, or when they enter transition points to some programs. And so these kinds of institutional tracks help them anticipate the lowered grades or deal with them through tutoring, through peer contact and things like that. And many of the programs were exclusive and considered long-standing interest in career. So, one young woman, Gail, who worked in pharmacy in high school, was able to show that she had been interested in pharmacy for a long time, was admitted early to a pre-professional track that combined undergrad degree with a graduate degree in pharmacy in 6 years. And so these young women, as I mentioned before, were able to transpose those skills in reaching out to people within the college and things like that to help them plan. And rarely, really, they as I'll mention, they got support from family, but generally we're using support from the institutions much more. Some working class young women did get into the on-track group. None of them were admitted into these exclusive pre-professional programs. So for one example, it also, I should say, for all of them, it took them a little bit slower to kind of get on track. So Shauna, who is a working class Black young woman, took a year off from high school and worked, and then enrolled in college. And she switched her major several times, trying to find her fit. And she eventually ended up in a respiratory therapy track, which is kind of a not as exclusive track, but it did, support her through the rest of college. And she was able to graduate with a degree. But she did take a slower route, both the year off, as well as she occasionally took off semesters to work and earn money. Parents were also sources of support for middle-class young women, particularly when they went astray, something happened, and they needed kind of a redirection. For working-class young women, families could also need support from them. Certainly not for all of them, but Denise, for example, who was in a very selective college, university, doing very well, but her mother was often depressed and needed her support. And she said to me, most people have someone else their own age to take care of them or to be a companion all the time. It's not up to me to be that for her because I'm supposed to be going on and having my own life now. But she still was torn, and still, like, she and her boyfriend would take her mother on dates with them just to So she would have someone to be with, right? The other thing I found in this group, none of the young women were working intensively, even among the working class while they were in school. Middle class support allowed a lot of the middle class young women to take internships as well. Their goals generally stayed about the same from what they were in high school, or if they shifted, it was another professional track as well. So if young women on track were moving forward toward their goals in a fixed pathway, holding on young women were working furiously to stay in place. What epitomizes this group of young women is how they struggled to balance multiple domains of life, school, work, and family, while chasing the American dream. This required a great deal of creatively navigating all three life domains. So Jenny, for example, was a poor young woman that I interviewed, very smart young woman. When she graduated from high school, she had been dating her boyfriend for about 3 weeks, and she left home to move in with him immediately. She loved her mother very much, but her mother was a hoarder. She had 30 or 40 cats, and Jenny said this just isn't a house they could live in, basically. She was very lucky in many ways. Her relationship with her boyfriend stayed, and they were still together when they interviewed her several years later. She also delayed college initially to work 50 hours a week at a pizza chain, earning $900 every 2 weeks. And then she enrolled in college. After one semester, she felt alienated from college. It was like too far from where she was living, and so she transferred to another college closer to home. When I interviewed her, she was still enrolled in college and doing pretty well. She had a GPA of 3.4, but she had moved jobs several times to accommodate her school schedule. She was delayed in college. She was placed into remedial coursework in math, even though she had been in advanced math in high school and done very well, and she was doing very well in college generally. There's a lot of research showing that remedial coursework just delays young people and doesn't have any benefits to them. And so this is what I saw in some of these young women, including Jenny. She also wanted to complete a business degree, which would require courses at the main campus. Usually, she was at a branch campus. Usually this meant just moving to the main campus, but that also meant paying a higher tuition, and she was maxed out on the Pell Grant. She was working overtime, and she was getting loans every semester. So she was trying to navigate taking more classes at the branch campus every semester while finishing the degree at the main campus in order to keep her tuition low. These campuses were over an hour away from each other. So navigating all of that was a strain, and she was doing it, but she was barely holding on. And this was very similar. The young women I spoke to, sometimes they were balancing all three domains. Some, like Jenny, were balancing something like school and work intensively. They all either worked full-time or intensive part-time while enrolled in college. They were earning low pay, and generally about half were enrolled in college. And many provided reciprocal support to family members as well. So young women like Madeline was working, or she was attending college full-time, she was working intensive part-time, and she was helping her mother take care of her younger brother, including things like going to IEP meetings at his elementary school. And all of these young women were trying to complete a college degree, but their paths through post-secondary schooling were not smooth. Half of them transferred college at least once, and one moved in and out of student status at the same school. Sometimes they switched majors frequently, or completed an associate's degree or a post-secondary certificate by the time I talked to them, but only one was working in the field in which they completed a degree. And all of them had loans from these programs. And the remaining three in this group either did not attend college or attended for a year before dropping out. And many of the pitfalls we can see on display with these young women. So Jennifer, who is a Black working class background, she was recruited by or encouraged to go to a particular college when she was in high school by a college recruiter who was in her school. And so she decided to enroll. She drove to the school in Connecticut in the fall after her senior year, and she got there and discovered that financial aid did not cover her needs, and she didn't have the money to pay the remainder of her bill. And she drove home the same day. Later, Jennifer explained that she didn't know the college was a private school, and she assumed that this explained the financial difficulty she encountered. In truth, however, the college was a for-profit post-secondary school, one that was soon under investigation by the federal government for aggressive marketing, high cost, and poor student retention. Jennifer didn't know this. She relied on adults to guide her college decision-making and put her trust in the college representative that came to her school. She enrolled in another college, got good grades for one semester, and then poor grades the next semester because her aunt who she lived with had a drinking problem and this cropped up. She enrolled in a different school, good grades for one semester, and then she lost the use of her car and couldn't get to campus and started failing again. When I spoke to her, she was working, still wanted to complete college, and she said, I've been thinking about how to go back to school to get certified in business management. And then hopefully from there, I can go back and get an associate's degree. And I could just keep building, but I really want to go back and get certified, complete that milestone, instead of wearing myself out. And in theory, what I want to explain about her plan and others like it is that they show what we say we want in young people: high aspirations, planning. She used social ties to find a college. She showed initiative, persistence, grit, like whatever words we want to say about young people and what they should be doing. And yet, because these colleges are out there that exploit young people's aspirations, that doesn't really help her a lot, right? We have this higher education landscape that isn't serving them well and ends up drowning young people in loans. The other thing I want to mention about this group very briefly is many of them switched to an interest in business once they were in college. And I think this is a combination of being immersed in the work world at the same time, as well as looking for expedient degree. I found it very interesting, and it's inspiring new work. So lastly, I found that middle-class young women who were in the holding on group, this was a soft landing for them if they had if they had abused drugs or had some sort of major-ish incident. But this was kind of an easier landing than ending up all the way and navigating rough seas. So that's often why we saw some downward mobility into this group. And young women in this group, particularly from the working class and poor, blame themselves for not getting as far as they wanted to where they were in high school. So Holly, who was a working class white young woman, described herself as lazy and not a planner when I interviewed her, and blamed herself for not doing better in school, despite the fact that she was juggling classes, working nearly full time, alongside her father's oxycodone addiction, her grandmother's progressing dementia, and the death of 2 friends by suicide. And she acknowledged that she had received very little help from her family and that her academic preparation at her high school had not been sufficient for college. And in fact, that a career counselor told her that, like, oh, I know your high school and it's not very good. And we see kids drop out. And yet she still placed the blame on herself. So the last group was young women who were navigating rough seas. And these young women found themselves inundated by challenges during the transition to adulthood, which made moving forward toward their goals extremely difficult. These often included family responsibilities and conflicts, health problems, lack of workplace protections, and a lower ed market focused on selling quick credentials to the working class and poor. And what's more, these problems compounded each other. So family responsibilities made short-term educational certificates of healing, health problems interfered with work, as well as family responsibilities interfering with work. So Britt is very savvy, straight A student when I interviewed her in high school. She lived with many family members in high school and graduated early so that she could start working before going to college. But right around the time she graduated high school, she and her mother lost their house. Her grandmother had died. She was the owner. So she and her mother moved into a trailer with Britt's boyfriend and his mother, where they stayed for a little less than a year. She found out her boyfriend was cheating on her and she broke up with him and they kicked them out. When I interviewed her, they had found a new rental in a home, and she had found out she was pregnant right after she broke up with her boyfriend. So she then had a son, and she was living with her mother, her sister who was under house arrest, her sister's 2 children, and her own son, and she was taking care of all the children. She had at one point enrolled in college, but was plagued by anxiety over driving and dropped out. And then she completed an unaccredited dental assisting course. Which she could tell was not well run. The woman didn't know what she was doing, but she wanted to get a job. And so she tried that. She applied to jobs and didn't get any from that. She still wanted to go back to college and get a job that allowed her to move out of the house, but sort of the conflict of like which to do first and also how to deal with childcare was overwhelming. And young women like Britt are often referred to as disconnected youth because they're not enrolled in school or working. But I argue in the book that this isn't really accurate. For one, she's doing unpaid labor in the home and that has an economic value. But for another, they're more in and out of school and work rather than being fully disconnected over time. And so those young women in navigating rough seas often enrolled in college, but dropped out after a fairly short period of time. For some, this was due to academic troubles or failing courses. Others found bureaucratic hurdles overwhelming in college, and sometimes commitment to work and family as well. 3 young women finished a short-term degree, but none of them found work in their field, and none were yet employed in the field in which they held their degree. Almost none were disconnected from higher education institutions. It's just that they were intermittently connected. Shauna, for example, initially tried to enroll in an associate's degree program at a not-for-profit college, but she was overwhelmed by the bureaucracy of just completing the enrollment, financial aid. She kept going in, would need new forms and so on. She gave up. She stayed out for a year. She worked, and then she went back to school a year later now at a for-profit college. They make it easy to enroll in their school. They make it easy to do the financial aid forms. She completed a degree in medical assisting and accrued loans of $30,000 at a school she later found was not accredited. She was unable to find a job in this field, and so she went back to the same job she had been working before as a state-tested nursing aide for very low pay. When I spoke to her, her loans would soon come due for $300 a month, and she and her husband couldn't afford that. So she was considering returning to school to become a registered nurse at a school that cost $37,000. And she reasoned that this was a good deal if the other one was $30,000 for a much lower degree, and this one was a higher degree. Stephanie DeLuca has called these kinds of the for-profit institutions and college programs as well, in general, that don't pay off, as educational traps. And Tristan McMillan Cottom talks about for-profit colleges selling the education gospel and making things easy to enroll in order to get the money from loans or tuition and so on. Young women from the working class and poor families don't have the guidance or knowledge to avoid these traps. They also don't, once they leave high school, they don't even have, high school counselors who can advise them on what might be a good idea or something that's risky. In addition to this, many of these young women were working when they did in low-wage jobs with a great deal of precarity, and they lost jobs over fairly small incidences or just layoffs. Many had to quit in response to pregnancies because there were no accommodations for the physical expectations. So many who worked in nursing homes or things like that simply couldn't do it while pregnant, as well as the fact that despite laws, they generally were unable to pump at work. And so they generally stayed out of the workforce while they were breastfeeding. And pregnancies did push some young women into rough seas from where they appeared to be heading, but often they were sort of already in these difficult scenarios already, and pregnancy just kind of compounded and made it more difficult to get back to college. And some young women had serious setbacks that led them into rough seas, things like mental health issues, as well as drug use and so on that led them into the navigating rough seas group. And what I found when I asked them about where they expected to be in the future, they really had a sense of life already being unpredictable, things happening to them in ways that they didn't expect. And so they really looked at the future very fatalistically. One young woman I interviewed, I said, where do you expect to see yourself at age 30? She said, wherever the wind freaking takes me, right? Other young women would say, wherever God has planned for me. But there was much less of a sense anymore of being able to plan because things were so unpredictable. So overall, I found that plans and planning for true social networks were stratified by class and race. And it's not just a matter of encouraging high aspirations or even basic information about matching educational and occupational goals, but that some young women get real resources from a range of social ties and some do not. I find the deregulation of the educational institutions, the labor market, coupled with high aspirations, create pitfalls for students not ensconced in high resource college programs. There are pathways through some educational institutions that lead nowhere. And the labor market provides no guarantee of hours, benefits, or stable employment. And I also argue that college students are tracked now within colleges and universities, particularly within the not-for-profit colleges and universities. There are tracks that lead to different kinds of resources and often vastly different kinds of resources to students. And finally, and I'll return to that, and finally, social mobility shapes young women's experiences in the transition to adulthood as well. And so I want to talk a little bit more broadly about what this means. So the role of planning and status attainment is conditioned by the landscape of higher education and young people's information about that landscape, how well they're able to navigate that. One thing I found really interesting is that working class and poor young women would say, oh, I saw a billboard about this college, I'm going to go look into it. Whereas those seem just completely not even seen by middle class young people, right? Because they had different kinds of information coming at them. And this creates opportunities for some and exploitation for others based on class background and a certain degree of luck. So in other words, if the higher education system were connected to labor, and its connection to the labor force were relatively straightforward, then ambition and academic preparation would be sufficient. Instead, our higher education landscape and its connections to the labor force is labyrinthian, which demands not only more detailed plans, but also particular positionality in order to successfully navigate. So the structure of these institutions shapes how young people plan, as well as how their plans pay off. And the other thing I want to argue is that we are seeing the existence of effectively maintained inequality in higher education. This is the theory by Samuel Lucas, arguing that as a certain level of education becomes universal, it starts to horizontally stratify. And certainly we see that between types of institutions, but it's also true within universities like UNC and CUNY where I am and things like that there are honors programs and professional tracks and things like that. And they offer vastly different resources than to young people who come in as general college majors, don't have those kinds of particular either interests or identifications as honors students. Thank you.
And sociology, social scientists have now talked about aspirations for a long time. You cited Hauser and Sue, and so in their quantitative model, they added aspiration, but that's 1960s, 70s. Then the strong critique on any modeling, including aspiration, they would refer to as endogenous. And so for a long time, I agree. Actually, generally, I think aspiration is very important, apart from what you want to do. Your efforts, your persistence. And I think Adam and we were been working on this project for 34 years. We want to try add aspiration in the quantitative modeling framework, predicting educational outcome. And of course, we're aware of the critique, right? The strong critique. They would kill any paper, including aspiration. They would say that's really reverse. And I think we thought maybe we could add a genetic and background for the individuals. I would maybe address some of the advantages. I think what you said here, very interesting, also very helpful for us. I think that's a social circumstances also and important for aspirations, right? How you can realize your aspiration, how you actually structure aspiration. That's very much influenced by your social conditions. But I think this is, this is much more sophisticated versions of critiques of simple inclusions of aspiration in the statistical model, right? But you need to really consider lots of other things. And in the model, if you consider aspiration simultaneously, I think, what might be your suggestions for the quantitative modeling framework? What we should do? We should read your book, but yes.
Yeah, no, I know. I think that's a good question.
Yeah.
We want to be able to model these things, right? Like, there's a lot of complexity here that you can't necessarily get into a statistical model. I think, in particular, it's important to consider, what do the young people have available around them? So one way to get around this is like pulling in contextual factors, right? Like, there was a really good study, actually, that I was originally going to do and gave up, and then somebody did it, I think. But looking at what, are there good colleges near someone versus far away? And how does that affect? So like, if you can build in a little bit of like, what kind of social structure might facilitate an aspiration having a higher payoff than not, then you might get at some of these structural factors that are going to be intertwined with their aspiration. You know, there's also a decent data on social networks to some degree, and so that maybe could be exploited as well. But I think it's a question of, can you get at how much sustained support they have, right? Rather than just like, okay, I know these people, at least in terms of racial differences. I think size of networks really could matter for class differences. Yeah.
A couple of thoughts. I was wondering, did you notice tracking in the high school as well? Did that sort of continue from college?
Yes.
And then another thought I was wondering about was, there's this perception that one of these predatory schools often looks better than a local public junior college or something like that, or community college. And it's just kind of an interesting, I've seen it, and I've always wondered, how do you break that? So be like, hey, go to the cheap junior college and get your stuff done and then transfer if you need to. But I mean, it's an interesting that this perception, I guess, aspiration sort of traps in these individuals.
Yeah.
I didn't know what the community college system looked like in the state. Was it large? Was it small? Was it not really existent?
It was pretty large. I mean, I don't know in terms of like comparison to other states, in the sense I think community colleges are fairly widely available anywhere you go. But certainly there were a lot. This is in the Midwest. So also branch campuses were based, like I call branch campuses community colleges because they're the same, but there's a little bit more resource there than there might be at a standalone community college. So some went to branch, some standalone. There are also a lot more mixed universities where they're sort of community college-like, but you can get bachelor's degrees. So there's also a little bit of fudging on types sometimes. I want to, for your first question, yes, there was high school tracking. There's more, so, you know, as we know, like you can be advanced in one area and not in another. And so I think there was more variation among the working class and poor in terms of like being in some advanced and not others, rather than just always being somewhere just in general. And that was true for some middle class as well, but there was also variation in how many tracks. So one school that was a little bit more working class had just two. So it was like either you were college going or general, and the other one had kind of like honors and then college prep and then general, which allowed a little bit more obfuscation. Like the students could think, oh, I'm on college track, but you know, how many resources were they getting and things like that. But yeah, I think you know, these community colleges were relatively plentiful, but they're not spending the money on marketing in the same way. They don't have money to spend on marketing in the same way, and people dedicated to enrolling young people in the programs and things like that.
Yeah, I think I have two questions. The first one, I'd love to hear more about the family, the plans for family and how that interacted with career and education. And also, if you're planning to turn this into a 20 to 30 year labor of love and follow up with them in the 30s. And then the second question is about the business aspirations was pretty interesting. Is that sort of like entrepreneurship or starting a franchise or getting some sort of like credential to manage people? What did that look like?
Yeah. So let me actually write it down. So family, business. What was the middle one? Sorry.
Long term.
Long term.
Yeah.
Short one on that is no. And I saw there's a question in the chat, so I'll go to that next. But so the family stuff was really interesting. So one of the reasons that I spoke to young women is I really wanted to know about how they were thinking about balancing work and family. And what I found when they were in high school, the middle class young women much more were sort of pushed towards flexible work that they could go down to part-time, work that they could take time off of and go back to in the future. Whether or not this was true about those careers, there was more sort of specific guidance from that. One mother actually even told her daughter, like, she wanted to be a lawyer, and she was like, you can't do that. Look at your father. He's gone from like 5 a.m. to 7 p.m. and you can't have a family that way. And so she kind of like guided her. Others were less, top down, but they would just say, oh, this is great because it's flexible. Working class and poor young women didn't get that kind of guidance, but there were differences. They still would say, if I asked them, like, would you take time off, you know, to have a child or something, they would say yes, but often they meant like a few months. Like, they didn't really have a sense of what that meant. But there were also differences in terms of how they thought about careers. So middle-class young women often talked about wanting to build a career to show that they could support a family, and then they could pull back. It was kind of like, I call it a manifestation of independence. They want to show that ability. Whereas working class and poor young women would say they wanted to build a career before having children so they could protect themselves essentially against being left by a partner, not, you know, basically not believing in the security of being married. So I found that really interesting. And then obviously family, they were in very different stages of family when I re-interviewed them. The on-track girls generally were sort of like, I don't want to deal with this right now. Only the working class girls who were on track sometimes had long-term boyfriends and felt more connected there, but the others generally were not trying to date seriously. Yeah, long-term, it would be nice, but I don't think I have it in me to track them again. All the first time. And yeah, the business I find fascinating. You know, a lot of them would say, I want to be my own boss. So sort of more in the entrepreneurial element, although some were interested, one person was interested in HR. So there's a variety. I think it's part that schooling isn't all encompassing. You're not like in clubs and things like that, right? And so what appeals to them is a kind of more practical arts of business classes. And then they have problems with bosses, they have like unpredictable schedules. And so to them, being in business, being sort of independent and being a boss is appealing to them in that respect as well. But I am curious about how good these businesses are. We know people who graduate with business degrees do better on average, but I'm very interested in the proliferation of business programs and how much that's watering down the benefits of going to business law. That's one thing I would love to look at in the future. There was a question in here. Sorry, I'm not able to scroll, I think. Oh, I didn't do any natural language. So the question on the chat was whether I use any natural language processing, and I didn't. I did much more like hand coding, whether it was actually by hand or by computer, than that. And I didn't really, you know, I quantified some things in basic ways in a spreadsheet, but I didn't do a lot.
Since you began with McLeod's making it, it's interesting, the comparison, I think, because in that book, the comparison group, the brothers do everything right. They have high upgrades. That's what it really stresses like the first book. And then the follow-up, you find like they failed, they came up short. And that the problem was they blamed themselves. They internalized it, still accepted the achievement ideology. But saw there's something wrong with them rather than the system. So McLeod's saying it's a structure. I think sort of parallel to what you're finding here, where you're saying that when you followed up there, they blame themselves for falling short, despite what you are pointing out to as like the inequality producing aspects of the university system. And I wonder if, like, are you pointing toward, like, did you see any hints on their part of a critique of the way the system is, you know, the university system is run? And could that be like, because I think you look now, like the cost of college education and the potential pitfalls, the risks associated with it. Like if you go to Duke and you don't succeed, you know, and the definition of what success is, like all A's. I mean, so that pressure. But I feel like now it's sort of the point where there are students who are making that critique that we need some sort of reform. It's a system that's stacked against them. But that's sort of like maybe like paying for the party, that sort of pessimism that the educational institutions are happy just sort of passing working class students along and allowing them to bear. Do you see, could it be that you're like, are your students like maybe it's like historical, like is that the past? Like they sort of just believe that these institutions are here to help them? Do you see any critique, I guess is my question. And do you feel that this sort of echoes perhaps, although McLeod's sort of blaming it's the overall structure, here you're sort of saying maybe the educational structure, you sort of see any echo in McLeod?
And I do think it's the overall structure, but where I'm seeing them is in the education structure and what's failing there. Somewhat labor force as well, but like that's, you know, so I agree with the thought about that. I think that, you know, it's interesting, they didn't have critiques pretty much at all. I agree with you though, that that's in the ethos more right now. And I wonder if even if I did this now, would it change? Would they have more critiques to the system and how it didn't support them? Because I do think there's more openness about that, which is somewhat tied to like Black Lives Matter, or like just a general bigger conversation about structural inequities and structural inequality, or of course inequality. And so I think that there is a little bit more room for that right now. I think in terms of like what the higher education institutions can do, but a lot of this is funding. So a lot of this does go back to like Laura Hamilton's work, showing how because universities aren't funded by the state governments to the same degree, they're really reliant on wealthy students. And so they make everything catered towards wealthy students because they need that funding. They need their money later in the form of donations and things like that. And so they aren't incentivized to support all students to the same degree. Also, introductory classes are much cheaper than advanced classes. So there's an impetus to get students in the door, but not as much for working class students to really support them along at the higher levels, which I think, you know, whether or not they're thinking through that exactly, because I know there is some encouragement in terms of, you know, wanting to show graduation rates. So there's a little bit of that, but they don't have the same level of motivation to help students along in the same way. But yeah, I mean, this is, I think, why we need to look at structures, and unfortunately, it's an interlocking structure, right? Like it's the funding to universities, it's the actual oversight of for-profit colleges, and even some not-for-profit. There were programs at not-for-profit colleges that were there to make money for the institution, but didn't necessarily lead to jobs. So I don't let them off the hook in that regard, because I think they were responsible too. They just had lower costs to the students. And then there's things like the connection to labor force. I don't know if that answered all your questions.
Yep, I want to bring this a little bit closer to demography and specifically about teenager pregnancy and abortion. And you have a couple cases like that. So my question is, how much of agency they did have in the decision of have a partner and decide to terminate or continue with pregnancy, or whether there were anyone of them viewed this as an alternative achievement. That's something they have control over. I at least have someone to love.
Yeah, so none of them mentioned, like when I asked them, like, what do you think when you first got pregnant? They would say, I was so scared, whatever. But none of them mentioned like ever considering terminating. This is a fairly conservative area. Not everyone I interviewed was necessarily conservative, but that might have just not been, as open. And I didn't specifically ask. But I do think there is a sense of, that once they had the child, they were very happy, and that this was something that they could excel at, right? In a similar way, so I meant to mention this in response to another question, but Jen Silva's work, which I love, shows that working class people, because they can't, there are impediments to completing what we normally think of as like regular markers to transition to adulthood, getting married, being in the labor force steadily, finishing college, things like that. They use kind of narratives of personal growth as a way to show, like, I've come into my being, I am an adult, things like that. And I think being a parent can be part, and I saw this too, that there were stories of overcoming various obstacles, and also becoming a parent and being responsible became part of that as well. Many of them got pregnant sort of accidentally. Generally, they weren't planning at least first children. Most with children were still partnered with either boyfriend, husband, depending on if they got married, but certainly not all were, and so that kind of folded into their lives. Obviously having children creates this additional barrier. I am hesitant to say, like, that's why they're navigating overseas, partially because the quantitative literature doesn't necessarily show us that. But certainly I think it complicated their lives, but also potentially, the quantitative literature also shows us, is it's allowed them to sort of feel that sense of responsibility and maybe even have it be a turning point in moving towards like eventually things like work and school, but it wasn't there yet when I interviewed any of them. Yeah,
I think you.
Either one. Sorry, I didn't see.
Yeah, quick question. So I think earlier you had mentioned something about major switching among one of the groups that you were tracking. So I was curious if you saw that among the upper class girls. And then I think the second question I had was around like loans. So did you notice any of the girls like taking out loans, and did that have their career interest or what they ended up doing?
So I just want to make sure the first question was like whether they switch majors, right? Okay. And then the second one was
the second one was around like loans, student loans, and
yeah,
the influence on their careers.
Oh, interesting. Okay, yeah. So in terms of majors, yes, there was some switching in the on-track girls or young women at that point. So some of them, like a couple, switched to teaching from like wanting to be science teachers. So there was some shit. One young woman who was very sweet, was like pre-med when she first went in, had some trouble with grades, but got them up, and she was doing well and was, you know, but just didn't like it. Like she just decided she didn't like it. And she had a real hard time like telling her family. Her father finally was like, "You're not enjoying this. Please go do what you want to do." And she switched to film. But you know, many of them also stayed, especially if they got into those early tracks, particularly. So there wasn't as much shifting, and there wasn't, I think, any transferring colleges. It's very common in the other groups. There's a lot of switching colleges in the other groups. Loans. I didn't. So you're saying like basically the fact of getting loans would change like what they want to do? Mm-hmm. No, I will say though that there's a lot of, and I think this is a generational thing, there was a lot of practicality that they thought about in high school. So the young women are very focused on like getting a stable career, earning enough to support a family pretty early on. And so I think what would happen is some going in, maybe they were like in the arts and had to take out all these loans and thought, oh God, like this is a bad idea, and switch majors. I think they were already considering that in high school, which might have just been because at that point they knew enough about loans. I think it was often their family encouraging them to be practical and things like that.
Sorry to interrupt. I know you're talking about someone else. We're actually out of time, so I want to call it officially here. And if you have other questions, she has a few minutes before heading off to lunch. You come up and ask. But join me in thanking Jess for a great talk.